This video contains spoilers up to and including episode 6 of season 2 of Snowpiercer. I wanted to release this video last week when episode 6 was still fresh, but I got sick and couldn't really do anything, so please accept my apologies. So in season 1, we're given little bits of information about what actually happened during the freeze, and our imagination has to fill in the rest. But in episode 6 of this season, we're actually shown what happened, and I've got to say it's not at all how I imagined. Just so we're clear, I'm not complaining that what we got was different to what I expected, only that what we got doesn't make a lot of sense, and makes for what is, in my opinion, a less powerful story compared to what we previously knew about the freeze. The first flashback we get is of Snowpiercer's completion, before anybody knows the freeze is coming. It's implied that there's a party going on in the train, but Melanie is alone in the engine room, and Wilford chooses to leave the party to seek her out. I think this really reinforces the fact that Wilford cared a lot about Melanie, and that beneath all his evil, he does have an appreciation for the simple pleasures in life, such as friendship and social intimacy. If all he cared about was power and glory, he probably would have stayed at the party. Now listen, I don't want you to think I'm defending Wilford. He's a monster. He's cruel and sadistic and totally irredeemable. But like all good villains, he's multifaceted, and although he seems to be completely without mercy or compassion, he is still human. Melanie says it's a beautiful thing they've created, and Wilford sort of bristles at the implication that this was a joint effort, as he wants all the credit. He says, I suppose it depends on how we define created. Melanie just sort of gives him a look like she's jokingly annoyed. This makes me think that this scene was set a long time ago. Melanie doesn't seem to be aware at this point of who Wilford really is, and though she's clearly used to his flaws, she doesn't seem to realise how deep they go. Anyway, to everyone's surprise, Wilford backpedals and ends up saying that Snowpiercer is just as much Melanie's as it is his. He's really honest with her and says that she'll never hear him repeat that in public, and Melanie is okay with that, saying whatever your investors need to hear. And this reminds us of something I think we all forget. Wilford is a businessman. He has a personal image that he needs to maintain for the sake of his company, and it makes me wonder if we've ever really seen the real Wilford. In public, he's charming and energetic. In private, he's controlling and aggressive. But what if both are an act? This scene shows us a side to him that we've never really seen before. He's genuine, open about his flaws, and he's able to overcome his narcissism, even if it's just for a moment. Now, Wilford has always been evil. We know he did terrible things before the freeze, but I wonder if he's gotten worse over time. Finally, this scene contains a big reveal that's just kind of glossed over. The Eternal Engine isn't actually eternal. I guess it was implied in season 1 when Melanie is really focused on the drawers, and LJ sort of says something about it, but to actually have it confirmed here is huge. Snowpiercer cost billions of dollars to make. Investors put hundreds of millions into what is essentially a faulty product. So now we can add fraud to Wilford's long list of crimes. The next flashback is set sometime later. Wilford and Melanie know the Earth is freezing, and they're preparing Snowpiercer to hold the last remnants of humanity. So much of this scene doesn't make sense. I always had it in my head that they had very little warning that the freeze was coming. But here it seems like they knew it was coming ages in advance. Wilford and Melanie have already come to terms with the fact that soon the only survivors of the human race will be aboard Snowpiercer. And they have enough warning that Wilford has time to make major renovations. Like, how does the government not seize the train? How are wars not started for the custody of Snowpiercer? Why did all these people wait until the 11th hour to board the train? How is it not getting swarmed already? Why aren't the other trains Wilford has being retrofitted to withstand the cold? So much about the story changes once you realise they had this much warning that the world was going to end. I'd always assumed they had maybe 3 days warning, if that, but this scene makes it seem like they had months. And also, why is Wilford only now building the night car, as an afterthought? Given everything we know about Wilford, why wasn't it put in as part of Snowpiercer's original design? It's a theatre with a bar and rooms where people can go to have sex. Surely that's the first thing Wilford puts on a luxury party train 10 miles long. Anyway, Melanie doesn't approve of the night car. She says it's a waste of space that could otherwise be used to house an additional 20 people. That's another thing. If they had time for renovations and stuff like this, why didn't they get rid of the really dumb stuff, like the bowling alley and swimming pool? Stuff they definitely wouldn't need. Wilford says that the night car is a place to let off steam and sustain the soul. Now, personally, I would want to maximise the number of people saved, but Wilford does kind of have a point. The quality of life of the survivors is something that needs to be taken into consideration. To oversimplify, this scene makes it seem like Melanie is concerned with rebuilding humanity after the freeze, whereas Wilford is trying to make sure they actually make it through the freeze. Now, like I said, I disagree with Wilford's decision, but I'm not agreeing with Melanie either. The well-being of the passengers is a factor that Melanie doesn't seem to be putting enough emphasis on. Melanie then brings up the geneticist that Wilford cut from the passenger list. This whole conversation is a reference to what Melanie tells Ruth in season 1. He didn't think it was possible to save humankind, and he was never even going to try. He was going to waste it. All he wanted was to live as well as he could for as long as he could, surrounded by accolades and booze and whores in the night car. We wouldn't have made it one revolution. This scene shows us that that's not exactly true. If Wilfred didn't care about saving the world, he would have cut all of Melanie's geneticists, not just half of them, and he wouldn't have budged when she confronted him about it. Instead, he concedes that Melanie is right and allows her to bring the geneticists on the train. That's massive for Wilfred, given what a narcissist he is. He does tell Melanie that the geneticists aren't allowed to bring their families on board, and this is clearly his way of saving face. He knows that Melanie is right and wants to give her what she wants, but he also doesn't want to admit that he's lost the argument. And by the way, to make room for the geneticists, they have to cut some of the jackboots from the passenger list. Both of them are playing God, deciding who gets to live, who gets saved, and who dies. Wilfred is reluctant to cut jackboots, and Melanie accuses him of being too concerned with his personal security. She's clearly more aware now of Wilfred's narcissism than she was in the previous flashback. Wilfred counters by saying that the jackboots are there for everyone, to preserve order. Now this is a classic dictator line and it's pretty transparent, but the fact is that Wilfred once again kinda has a point. Order does need to be maintained, and Season 2 has shown us what Snowpiercer looks like without the jackboots. Melanie says there are more important things than order, and Wilfred is basically like, does not compute, order is spiffing. Melanie asks Wilfred if he even believes in saving humanity, which is kind of unreasonable. Again, I'm not defending Wilfred, but he gave Melanie the geneticists, sacrificing the lives of his personal guard to do so, and she's getting mad that he won't let them bring their families on board. I mean, was she really expecting anything more from Wilfred? She knows he's a narcissist. I'm surprised she got this far. Wilfred gets really angry at this, so angry that he threatens to kill Melanie's family. Now, if all the stuff Melanie said in Season 1 about how Wilfred only cares about blackjack and hookers was true, why does this accusation from Melanie upset him so much? Basically what I'm saying is, I think Melanie is wrong about Wilfred, and that this scene shows us that they both want to preserve humanity. They just have different ideas on how to do it, and neither wants to compromise. Wilfred refers to himself as Snowpiercer's head engineer, which does imply that he knows how the engine works. He did more than just bankroll Snowpiercer. This was a real relief for me, because Wilfred in the movie is a genius, and I was worried that the show was going to reduce him to some privileged rich kid who doesn't know anything about engineering. It looks like we might get to see Wilfred's engineering side in the near future, and I'm really excited about it. He says that Snowpiercer runs on his order, which confirms for us that when he talks about preserving order, he's really talking about maintaining his control. He's also kind of backtracking on what he said in the last flashback. He's reminding Melanie that they're not partners or equals. He is the sole ruler of Snowpiercer. Wilfred concludes by saying not everything is going to be fine, but I promise you, you will survive. Here he's kind of turning Melanie's argument back on her. Melanie is prioritizing saving as many people as possible, whereas Wilfred is trying to make sure that the survivors, few as they may be, are comfortable. He's basically saying that simply surviving isn't really enough. The third flashback is on the eve of Snowpiercer's departure. Massive crowds of people are trying to board, and we see Wilfred. The revelation that Wilfred was on board Snowpiercer minutes before it departed really threw me. I'd always assumed that Wilfred and some others were still on their way, and that Melanie left a few hours early, not a few minutes. Which would explain why Kevin says that Melanie left them to die. But now I don't know what to think. Why weren't people like Kevin and Amelia on board? There's a theory about this that I'll talk about later, but I still don't think it paints a full picture. Wilfred is angry at Melanie because she convinced him to cut 6 jackboots, and he's thinking he could really use them right about now. But then she says Commander Grey's on the line, and Wilfred's demeanour completely changes. I think it's really cute how Wilfred calls Grey old blood and thunder, and is kind of casual with him. It reminds us that Wilfred has a real way with people. We as an audience know how evil Wilfred is, but most of the characters don't. Grey adores Wilfred, and this short exchange makes it easy to see why. Doesn't everyone want to work for someone who treats them as an old friend? I think it's good of the show to remind us why so many people support Wilfred despite him being so evil. Wilfred tells Grey to do whatever it takes to hold off the people trying to board the train. This isn't as ruthless as it sounds though. All these people are going to die anyway, so Wilfred probably doesn't think too much about shooting them. When all is said and done, it's probably better than freezing to death. When Wilfred hangs up, he says, "Last train to Clarksville, people." This is a reference to a song by the Monkees about a man urging his lover to meet him at the train station so he can say goodbye before he has to leave, probably forever. So yeah, it's an apt metaphor. By the way, I love the Monkees. Daydream Believer is one of my favourite songs. Oh, and another thing, Last Train to Clarksville was released in 1966, which is probably the year Wilfred was born. Wilfred's ready to leave, but Melanie protests that her family hasn't arrived yet. Bennett is obviously afraid that this won't be enough reason for Wilfred to stay, because he lies to him about the engine needing to cycle up. Personally, I'd have been interested to see if Wilfred would have willingly waited for Melanie's family. Then the geneticists show up, and the flashback ends. Now, before we go on to the fourth flashback, let me talk about that theory I mentioned. So basically, some people in the Snowpiercer Facebook group have speculated that Big Alice was originally meant to be hooked onto Snowpiercer for the whole journey, but Melanie decided to leave it behind. It makes sense for a lot of reasons. It explains why it has that sweet docking mechanism, why various staff weren't on Snowpiercer, and why it's so chock full of parts that Snowpiercer needs. The main reason I don't believe this theory is that no one mentions Big Alice in this flashback. If towing Big Alice was part of the original plan, then surely they'd be talking about it, especially considering Melanie leaves them behind. Now, I personally don't believe that Big Alice was originally part of the plan at all, but that does leave a lot of holes in the plot. Now on to the fourth flashback. Melanie explains to Wilfred that the crowd of people are her geneticists. Wilfred goes from annoyed to angry and says that he agreed she could have 6 and that he was regretting the decision given the circumstances. Melanie says that she's not leaving without all of them and that they don't have time to discuss it. She's trying to force Wilfred's hand, which is just so dumb. Pretty much everything Wilfred does is motivated by his need to assert dominance. Melanie should know him well enough to know that trying to force him to do anything is going to provoke violent overcorrection on his part. Whenever someone tries to undermine his authority, he punishes them to make a point. He's already said twice that he was regretting allowing the geneticists on board, and then they show up and we see that Melanie has ignored his orders. And then she acts all shocked and surprised when he has them killed. Like, what did she think he was going to do? I'm obviously not saying what Wilfred does was right. It was very, very wrong. But seriously, Melanie should have known this was going to happen. It's just such a predictable reaction from someone like Wilfred. And she's known him for over 25 years now, almost 2/3 of her life. Why did she think antagonizing him in this moment was going to work? This is the final straw for Melanie. Killing the geneticist cements the idea in Melanie's mind that Wilfred has no interest in saving humanity, which again I don't think is entirely true, when it's clearly nothing more than a power move. Honestly, if there's one thing I got from this episode, it's that Wilfred is a better person than I thought he was. Which is saying basically nothing, he's just slightly less of a monster. Still, I really don't think that's the message the writers wanted to get across when they wrote this episode. Now, in the fifth and final flashback, we see Melanie's decision to leave Wilfred and Alex behind, and this scene was really disappointing for me. I'd originally imagined that leaving Wilfred behind was a premeditated decision, that Melanie had put plans in place to leave before he arrived, and when Alex was delayed too, Melanie made the tough decision to leave rather than wait and allow Wilfred to reach Snowpiercer on time. But this flashback completely changes all that and makes Melanie's tough decision a lot less tough. Before Wilfred goes down train, he orders Melanie and Ben to be ready to depart as soon as he returns. Wilfred is angry at Melanie and it's clear he has no intention of waiting for her family. So Melanie isn't really choosing to leave Alex behind at all. She's being forced to leave her behind one way or another. What she's choosing is to leave Wilfred behind, which isn't a hard choice at all. This scene takes the choice out of Melanie's hands, and in doing so, massively changes a lot of what we think we know about her character. And that's one of my biggest complaints about this season. Melanie is a completely different person. Season 1 Melanie was the villain of the story. Sure, she was a complex villain with many redeeming qualities, but she was still the villain. She tortured people and took people's arms and made speeches to Leighton about order. She's ruthless and pragmatic, prioritizing the continuation of the human race as a whole over everything else. When she creates the plan to disconnect the 7 cars, she knows Leighton will have to leave some tailies to die, but she wants Leighton to have to make the same hard decision she had to make. She wants him to have a bitter taste of leadership. But the Melanie we get in Season 2 is a saint/superhero, and it's hard to imagine her doing any of the stuff she did in Season 1. What's more, everyone seems to have forgiven her. Josie is the only one who seems to actually remember that Season 1 ever happened. And to an extent, I get it. She's developed as a character, and she's no longer the leader of the train, so she doesn't have to make as many tough choices. Old enemies must unite in the face of a greater threat, and all that jazz. But Melanie's transformation goes beyond that. Her personality between seasons is unrecognizable. Now, I know I'm being pretty harsh here. Obviously, I love this show, otherwise I wouldn't be making so many videos on it. I even really enjoyed this episode for the most part, but I can also acknowledge the show isn't perfect, and Melanie's inconsistency is probably my biggest critique of this season. Anyway, back to the flashback, and we see that it's Ben who urges Melanie to leave. This debunks 2 common theories that I've heard. 1, that Bennett is secretly a Wilfred loyalist, and 2, that Bennett is Alex's father. It also kind of detracts from the image of Melanie as the headstrong leader of the engineering trio. Melanie only takes a few seconds to decide, which seems really strange, but it's also consistent with her character being calculating and practical. The rational part of her brain remains in control in a situation where most people's emotions would get the better of them. As she realizes she has to leave, the music that plays is so good. I'd recommend all of you go back and rewatch the scene and listen to the score. After you watch this video, of course. It's haunting, and it's eerie. Really eerie. If I can find the name of the song, I'll link it in the description. While Melanie is counting down to departure, we see the struggle going on in the tale. It's a reminder that what Melanie is really counting down to is the end of the Earth. Once she reaches 0, Snowpiercer becomes the world. In the struggle, we can see at least one of the jackboots is in the crowd that's not on the train, which makes me wonder if all of the jackboots present had tickets. Or did some of them believe so strongly in Wilfred's cause that they were willing to die defending Snowpiercer, even while knowing they would never get to board it? It wouldn't surprise me. As Snowpiercer departs, we see Wilfred outside the train, breathing heavily. I'm not really sure why he's breathing heavily, it's not like he was running, he said he was taking the jeep. The light shines on his face twice. The first time we see an expression of shock, but a second later we see that his face has hardened into a look of determined anger, and I love this so much. It was honestly probably my favourite moment of the episode. In the space of a moment, he's able to get over the shock of being left to die by his closest confidant, and he marshals his resolve. You can tell part of him is already plotting his revenge and planning his escape from the freeze. Death is not an option for Wilfred. I know I was just complaining about the writing of Melanie, but I've got to say that I think the writing for Wilfred is phenomenal, and Sean Bean is doing a fantastic job, just like we knew he would. As the train starts to gain speed, we see Ben finally lose his cool and begin to cry. Melanie is crying too, of course, and she quietly begs Alex for forgiveness, seeing the same vision she saw in episode 2 of her young daughter staring at her accusingly. It's super bleak, and I think the show needs more moments like these. The movie is constantly bleak in one way or another, and throughout the whole runtime you're never allowed to forget just what a terrible situation humanity is in. In the show, it's a little easier to forget just how dire the circumstances of this apocalypse are, and that's why I really appreciate moments like these. Well, that's all I've got for you lovely passengers. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.